Hi, I'm John Hixson. I'm with IX Systems, and I'm going to do a talk about FreeNAS. I'm going to do it a 1,000-foot level overview of how FreeNAS looks if you're programming for it. All right. The reason I'm doing this talk is to get more people on board. We only have a few that work on it currently. We'd like to get more people involved, and we'd like to give people more knowledge than what's available in the current documentation. The current documentation is basically how to use FreeNAS. There's not a whole lot available on how it looks coming in as a software engineer. So first things first, we use NanoBSD. And all that NanoBSD brings, we have the build script, and we've modified it quite a bit to include PBIs along with other extensions. We've added targets that it builds. We have several build targets. We have the FreeNAS build target, so we build the FreeNAS image. We have a jail image that we build for the plugins. And then we have plugins that we also build, and all of those are part of the build system. And dobuild.sh does all of that for you. So when you check out the source code to FreeNAS, you check out the branch. Right under the branch, you have NanoBSD, and under NanoBSD, you have these are the configuration files that I just spoke about. OS base is your configuration for FreeNAS itself. It's just a NanoBSD config file with all of our FreeNAS ports and customizations. Plugins base, same thing, but for the plugins jail. The plugins jail is a PBI. And underneath the plugins directory, that's where, if you have a plugin, currently we have 3 plugins, but if you have more, you just add more files in there. And then again, those are NanoBSD configuration files. And then under the files directory, that contains basically the FreeBSD hierarchy. You have user, local, etc, all of that. And so any files you want placed into those directories on FreeNAS, you're going to place under there. Currently, we only have a few that are in there. Most of it's stock FreeBSD. All right, so when you kick off a FreeNAS build, the first thing it does is you have to define the FreeNAS or FreeBSD CVS sub host, and it will either use CVS sub. If subversion's available, it'll use subversion. If not, it'll use CVS up, and it'll grab the FreeBSD source code. And once it does that, we have a patching directory, and I think that's the next slide. And it'll go through and it'll apply all of our local FreeBSD patches and ports patches. And that's right here. So under the patches directory, any patches you have for FreeBSD, they go in here in that format. .patch. And for the plugins jail and plugins, as I said, we're using PBI. We're using the same PBI format that PCBSD uses. So not quite yet. Currently, FreeNAS is on 8, and we're using version 9 PCBSD PBI, so you can't really take an 8 PBI and use it on FreeNAS 9. But once we move to 9 on FreeNAS, you'll be able to take PBIs from PCBSD and use them on FreeNAS. The installer, we've taken more from PCBSD. They give us so much good stuff, we keep taking more. We wrote a front end. It's just a shell script that generates the backend PC sysinstall config file. And then we just use PC sysinstall to install that image. And FreeNAS, it builds an image and it writes it out to disk. It doesn't do any kind of partitioning if you have a large hard drive. So, right now it's at 2 gigs. And if you have a 10 gig hard drive or 100, it's going to use the whole thing for FreeNAS, but you're only going to see 2 gigs. So use a flash drive. FreeNAS uses the Nginx web server, or Nginx. I've always called it Nginx. We used to use like HTTP. We switched to Nginx. We like it. It's faster. It's better. It's pretty straightforward. We don't do anything weird with it. We use fast CGI for the plugins. That's the only semi-weird thing. So plugins get installed in the jail as a PBI, and then every plugin has a web interface, and then that has to be able to speak with external to the jail, to the Nginx server through fast CGI. Oh, I'm sorry. And then Nginx only serves the static content. All of the dynamic content comes from Django. Django, early on, Django was chosen mainly because model view controller, and all of that hype. And it's pretty cool because everything you see in the FreeNAS interface, it's represented in Django as a model. So you get this really cool mapping from Python classes that are mapped directly to the database. I'm sure Ruby does that. I'm not familiar with the other ones, but I think it's pretty cool. And Django, you have models, views, and forms. So the model is a Python class, and then you have a form view, and then you have the view, although I don't think it's actually a view, but it's called a view. But it's where all of the methods get called that handle the data once it's submitted. I think the actual view in Django is the template files, which is your static content that is filled in dynamically. I guess you would call the heart of FreeNAS is the notifier. The notifier is this gargantuous Python class that has a method for everything. It started off, it was supposed to be kind of small, but we kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. And so now we would like to rewrite it. We'd like to make it a daemon. But for now, it's this class, and pretty much everything you do in the interface, it makes a call to the notifier. Everything, whether you're ZFS, anything you do with configuring ZFS with your interfaces, all of it, it's down at the bottom, it's making a call to notifier. And that's the notifier. Sure.
Is there a way to follow what it's doing to see sort of a log of those commands?
Okay, so yes. But you have to enable some various logging. It's not just a click this button and okay, I could watch it go from the web interface down to the bottom, of the shell. You have to log. You can turn on some stuff goes out to far log messaging. You can turn on some verbose logging. You can turn on debug logging. Django has its own logging. So there's a couple things involved. So if you're working on a particular field, you can turn all of that on and you'll get a good idea. But if you're just coming in, and you think, okay, what does this do? It's not as cut and dry as that. We use SQLite, small, fast. We don't need anything crazy, and it's also the mechanism that we use. So when we update, so that the data persists, because upgrades wipe out everything. So if you have any local files in your file system, anything, it goes bye-bye. It's wiped out. So everything that you want to keep, you either back up or put it onto a volume, or it's stored in the SQLite database. Okay, so boot. This is just nano BSD booting. You have your /conf base, and then you have var etc, and memory disks are created for each of those, and then all the content from those, it's copied over to the memory disk. And then afterwards, users mounted read-only, and then the volumes are mounted on /mount. etc.rc FreeNAS, that's pretty much all of, it's RC for FreeNAS. That's where we store all of our FreeNAS variables. RCconf local, that has a lot of the FreeNAS configuration when you boot. That's where most of the, like your network configuring, your routes, all of that happens in RCconf local. And then in RCD, we have a series of IX files. Perhaps those should be renamed, perhaps. However, they're IX, and those are all of our pre-RC scripts, as in they retrieve data from SQLite, and then they generate some sort of config file. I'll be going over these, like NSS switch, host, all of that comes from an IX file. It generates it, and then it continues to boot as normal. And then net CLI, that's our little shell. You don't have to run it, but by default, that's what comes on, and that's the menu, 1 through whatever it is that gives you the options to configure your interfaces and whatnot from the command line. System, okay, here we're going into the interface. So system, it's uname -a, nothing fancy there. None of it's stored or retrieved from the database. Under network, for global configuration, those network global configuration is the SQLite table. It's pretty much your default, your DNS, default route, just the standard configuration you do when you first get your FreeNAS box and want to configure it. Under interfaces, again, it's just another SQLite table. Your standard, IP address, mask, nothing fancy. We have a Python class that grabs all of that information. It's not necessarily in the database. It could be if you can define it if you define it in the interface, it'll store it to the database. But if not, this class will grab it. And that's handled in RCconf local, as I mentioned earlier. Aliases, same thing. Another table, looks very similar to network interfaces, except for now we have some keys so that network alias points to network interfaces, and that's handled in the same place that network interfaces. And lag, do the same thing. Lag's a little more interesting, and just you group together different interfaces, and you can have a different lag type and all that. But it's in the database. It's just another table that points to the interfaces and groups them together. VLAN, same thing. Static routes, very simple. So the basic volume is just a path and a disk. So volumes, they're just stored as paths and mount points. You can, we used to store more information, but a lot of people, they wanted to, and I don't blame them, they wanted to be able to manipulate ZFS from the command line. And so every time they did do so, it wouldn't reflect in the interface. So we got rid of a lot of the extra information where it carried, and now we keep it minimal so that you can just log in, and if you want to do ZFS and commands from the command line, it will reflect in the interface. And that's why it's so simple. snapshots are periodic snapshots. You define, the data sets and the volumes that you would like to snapshot, and then you're given an interval. It's basically a cron job. So, and that's what gets stored, recursive, and then it writes it out, not directly as a cron job, but we have a Python wrapper that will check if the Python wrapper is the actual cron job, and it determines if there's anything that's configured to be a snapshot. And this is how it's stored in the database. Snapshots, same thing. If you destroy a snapshot, it just calls notifier and just does away with it. Replication, it's just another table in the database, and I didn't fill in as much as I'd like to here. We do it with SSH, you do it with keys, and it's just a ZFS send and ZFS receive. Now on to sharing. We have three sharing types. We have Apple, AFP, Windows, CIFS, and then NFS, Unix. And these are pretty straightforward, just a name and a path at the simplest level. And for AFP, we have the standard IX script that writes out the configuration file. So in this case, netatalk, and it writes out Apple volumes. NFS, the standard IX script, and it writes out Etsy exports. And I think we've recently made it to where it actually understands everything that can be in Etsy exports. CIFS looks simple, but CIFS uses Samba, so there's nothing simple about it. It's ridiculously complicated. But for the share itself, simple, and we have all these other Samba settings that we write out, but the sharing part is pretty simple. It's your standard Samba share, and that's the IX Samba script that generates not just SMB conf, but everything, all the shares along with it. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a question?
Yeah. The Samba generates its own user-based database?
Database?
Yes.
Oh, you mean the
Samba.
TDB files?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you regenerate it each time?
No. Those are persistent. I don't remember at the moment, but they are persistent. Yes, those don't get regenerated every single time. They're under. You define a scratch area basically, and they stay under there. I don't remember where it's at the moment though. Sorry about that.
But are you using FreeBSD users throughout, or do you have a separate user table related question?
We got there. Okay. Yes, you can use your standard Etsy password FreeBSD users, but we're about to go into services. You can also have LDAP and Active Directory users as well, but not at the same time. Whoops. All right. So services, there's just a service table, and we have whatever 15 or 20 odd services, and it's just a service name and if it's enabled or not. That's the standard format for all of our services. Okay, here you go. My first slide, Active Directory. So Active Directory, once you enable it, to configure it, you have to put in your domain, workgroup, admin. It's pretty minimal as far as getting it going. Getting it actually to work can sometimes be complicated. As far as using it, that's where you'll get your users and groups from Active Directory. And so if you turn on Active Directory, it's not really a service, but it joins the domain. you now have Active Directory users and groups that'll come when you go to set your permissions. Those will now appear in your user and group lists. And did I put that in here? Yes, I did. Okay, so Active Directory, there's all kinds of stuff involved here. We have to generate a Kerberos file, and then we have to get a Kerberos ticket. And then we have to go touch all of these PAM files so that PAM services work with Active Directory users and groups. NSS switch, it has to be told to use WinBind. If your Active Directory supports Unix, if it has Unix extensions, then we don't actually use WinBind for name resolution. We use LDAP. And IX Active Directory, that joins the domain, and then IX Cache, that just caches all the users and groups locally so that it doesn't have to go out to Active Directory every time you do some kind of user or group operation. Samba, if Active Directory is turned on, it generates all of your WinBind directives for understanding Active Directory. I think I just went over that. You get a ticket, join the domain, cache the users. Apple. Earlier, we talked about the shares. This is where you actually turn the service on, and it generates your neta.conf and then all of your shares as well. AFP works with both LDAP and Active Directory, by the way. CIFS. It generates the smb.conf. IX Samba, again, it's pretty complicated because there's so many CIFS configurations possible and so many settings you can do. So even though there's 3 little things there, it's a monster. We support dynamic DNS. FTP. You can configure it like most FTP servers. It uses Pro FTP, just another service. I think you can run it in a jail or a SCH root. iSCSI, I don't even know where to begin with this one. I'm listing all the tables here. I go over it briefly. I don't have that deep of an understanding of iSCSI, but it's another complicated beast that we support, and we support it very well. And we have people that do know about it. So basically, all of those tables, for your iSCSI configuration, we use ISTGT, and for each file or directive in the file, it just pulls from a database table. Some of them, you have multiple weird joins to get done correctly. I documented the tables and how they're joined. Beyond that, I don't really understand it very well. LDAP, it's very similar to Active Directory and how we configure the system to work with it. Did I put it there? Okay, so IX LDAP, it will generate your open LDAP conf and your NSSS underscore LDAP conf. And it gets a little confusing because NSS underscore LDAP conf is what's required for PAM to be able to work. And then you have open LDAP, and it has a LDAP.conf that is necessary if you want to be able to go to the command line and LDAP search and your other LDAP commands. And to further complicate it, NSS underscore LDAP.conf Still, it's not necessary, but it complains very heavily and it logs very heavily if you don't name it LDAP.conf. So you have to link ns_LDAP.conf to LDAP.conf. Otherwise, it's loud and complains a lot. We do the same thing with IXCache. It caches your LDAP users. NSS switch, it adds LDAP to the NSS switch file. We go through PAM. We add the necessary modules and the correct order for LDAP user and group authentication. And Samba, Samba isn't necessary for LDAP to run. However, lots of people use it. And if you have LDAP turned on, then we configure Samba to understand LDAP. All right, I just went over this. NFS, straightforward. You go into the GUI, you define the paths that you would like to share and how you'd like to share them. It's stored in the database, and the exports gets generated. Something to keep in mind and something we'd like to work on and change in the future is a lot of these files, not all of them, but a lot of them, you can't edit by hand. It's all of your information is stored in the database, and every time you restart the service or boot up, it's going to rewrite over that file. So just something to keep in mind. It'd be great if we could get somebody to work on that. What's that?
Why don't you just have a hook for post-extraction so you can write a script and scribble?
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we? Patches are welcome. Plugins. What happens when you configure a plugin, or the plugin jail, you need to tell it the jail name, the path, the plugin's path, and IP address. And when you turn on plugins, it just starts up and configures the jail. And I think we had to patch backport vimage. I might be wrong, but we needed it for one of our plugins needed to do what was it? I don't remember. But a lot of people wanted it, so we had to do that. Multicasting, that was it. rsync, we support, and you can configure both rsync. Rsync, you can configure it as a server, or you can configure to push and pull as well. And that's done in the services rsync table. And that will generate rsyncd.conf. Smart. SNMP, it's pretty much the same. SSH. We don't really do anything fancy with SSH. By default, it's turned off. One of the first things everyone does is turn it on. TFTP, we run the standard stock FreeBSD TFTP server, and that's enabled in 9netD. We use, was it NET for, UPS? Okay, so users and groups. So you can configure users and groups from the interface, and all it does is, in the database, it's stored how you would think it'd be stored: users, groups, and then keys to what users are in what groups. Every time you make a change, etc master password is generated, and then the password database gets rebuilt and all of that. As described here. And my summary here is that we need help, we need more developers to add things like pre and post hooks for configuration files. And we need more plugins. We're a small group right now that are developing for FreeNAS, and we'd love to have more people come on and more people that understand it. All right, well, I guess that's it. Thank you for coming.